Hey guys, tonight we begin with ancient Greece, not the gleaming marble version from your textbooks, but the real one, where the medicine involved things that were still alive, the food had opinions, and the daily experience of simply being a person in a city that had invented democracy somehow still found ways to make most people's lives quite difficult. Then we move to Aspasia of Miletus, the woman who was arguably the most intellectually powerful person in 5th century Athens, and who was thanked for this by being put on trial. Then we step into the sandals of a symposiast, because attending an Athenian drinking party sounds like a civilized and refined evening, right up until you understand everything that was actually expected of you. And finally, we go behind the white columns of the Greek religious sanctuary, those perfectly composed spaces of divine order, to look at what was really happening inside them when the gods were technically in charge and the priests were making the actual decisions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in Athens and immediately your nose has questions. This is not the Athens of philosophy and sunlit columns and wise old men debating the nature of the good life in clean linen, with their hair arranged thoughtfully. This is Athens in the 5th century before the Common Era, on a warm morning in late summer, and the smell arrives before anything else, before sight, before sound, before the specific discomfort of the surface you have been sleeping on. It is a layered smell. Animals are the top note, the immediate presence of donkeys and oxen and dogs and the particular warm biology of creatures that live close to people. Below that, smoke, wood smoke from cooking fires already lit in the neighbouring households, already beginning the day's work without waiting for you. Below that, fish, dried and salted and ambient, the fish markets not far from here already conducting their business at a volume that carries. And below all of it, persistent and honest, the smell of a city that does not have a modern sewage system, does not have a plan for one, and has been here for long enough that the city's relationship with its own waste products has become a kind of settled acceptance. You lie still for a moment on your sleeping mat, which is on a wooden frame which is on a packed dirt floor, and you take a slow breath, and you immediately understand that you should have been slower about it. Welcome to your first morning in classical Athens. You are not a tourist. There are no tourists. You live here. You sit up slowly, because sitting up quickly on a mat on a wooden frame that has not been generous with your lumbar region is a decision you will regret immediately and remember for the rest of the day. The light comes through the small high window in your sleeping room, a strip of early sky that is already moving from the dark blue of pre-dawn toward the pale brightness that means sunrise is not far off. The room is plain by any standard and perfectly ordinary by Athenian standards. White plastered walls made from lime plaster applied over mud brick, the texture not entirely smooth, the colour not entirely even, the whole thing serviceable and cool to the touch in the morning. A clay oil lamp on a small shelf burned down to nothing, the wick a dark thread in cold oil. A wooden chest for your belongings, the lid fitting not quite perfectly, the wood slightly swollen from the summer air, and the mat which you are leaving as quickly as your back will allow. You stand. The floor under your feet is packed earth, hard and cool, and as floors go it is fine, it is what most Athenians have, and you have already stopped thinking about it the way you thought about it on the first day, which involved comparisons and regret. Your first task of the morning is navigating the house, which requires a particular kind of attention, because the house is organised not around corridors or planned traffic flow, but around the central courtyard, the open space at the heart of the structure. The rooms open directly onto the courtyard rather than onto hallways, which means that getting from one side of the house to the other requires passing through the courtyard itself, the outdoor centre of daily life, and the courtyard at this hour already has people in it. The women of the household are here, the slaves, if there are any in this household, are here, the cooking fire is here, or will be shortly, and the clay pots and the baskets and the wooden tools and everything that constitutes the operational reality of a Greek home is organised in this space and around it. The house is organised further by social logic as much as architectural logic. The women's quarters, the gynaeconitis, are typically at the back of the house, or on an upper floor if there is one. positioned to minimise the possibility of casual contact with male visitors and male household members who are not direct family. The front rooms, the men's rooms, are toward the street. This is not just architectural preference. It is a physical expression of how Athens thinks about gender and space and propriety, made permanent in mud, brick and lime plaster, repeated in house after house across the city, until the spatial arrangement itself feels like a natural law rather than a social choice. You use the clay pot kept near your sleeping room for your morning needs, because this is what people do, and the pot's contents will eventually be emptied into the street gutter, because this is also what people do, because Athens in the 5th century does not have a sewage system that removes waste from the city in any organised way. There is a rudimentary drainage system in some parts of the city, clay pipes running under certain streets, primarily for rainwater, but the management of human waste is essentially private, and essentially the same method that cities have been using since the beginning of cities. Put it somewhere outside and hope for the best. In Athens, that somewhere outside is often the gutter at the edge of the street, from which it is carried away by rain or by the flow of water from houses higher on the slope, or simply by time and evaporation and the determination of the human nose to eventually stop noticing things. You wash your face and hands from a clay basin near the courtyard's water source, because water has been fetched from the public fountain house, one of the neighbourhood fountains where water flows from the aqueducts that bring it down from the hills, and someone has already been to get it this morning. Fetching water is one of the daily tasks of Athenian life, and it falls, reliably, to the people with the least claim to avoid it, primarily enslaved people, and the women or girls of households without enslaved people. The public fountain houses are social spaces as well as practical ones. They appear on Athenian pottery in detailed painted scenes, women filling their large clay hydria vessels while talking to each other, arranged in rows at the spouts. The scenes so ordinary and so repeated that vase painters treat it as a background detail of daily life, the way a modern photograph might include a traffic light. The water, when you put your hands in it, is cool from the stone basin, not cold, not warm, present and real, and this is enough. Clothing comes next, and getting dressed in ancient Athens is not complicated in the way that buttons and zippers and the architecture of modern tailoring is complicated, but it requires a spatial reasoning that takes some adjustment. Your chiton is a single rectangle of fabric, wool in the cooler months, linen in summer, and you arrange it around your body, folding it at the top, and pin it at the shoulders with 2 metal pins, fibulae, small bronze or iron things with a hinge that catch the fabric and hold it. Then a belt, a zone, at the waist, which you can use to pull up extra fabric and create folds and adjust the overall drape. The whole garment is made from one piece of cloth. No cutting, no seaming except along one side. This sounds very simple. It requires practice to make it look like something rather than something that has been wrapped around a person. The quality of your chiton tells the city what it needs to know about you before you open your mouth. Fine, thin linen, naturally creamy white or dyed in muted natural colours, draped with the practiced ease of someone who's been wearing it for years, says citizen, comfortable, educated, aware of how to look. Rough undyed wool, pinned with a minimum of pins and barely belted, says labourer, or slave, or someone who does not have time for presentation. The Greeks understand this language of cloth fluently and read it continuously, because in a city without name tags or credentials, the body and what covers it is one of the primary signals available. Outside, Athens is already fully operational. The streets are narrow in a way that surprises people who have only seen the wide ceremonial routes of modern cities. The residential streets of Athens, the ones behind the agora and above the port, are barely wide enough for 2 people to pass each other comfortably, and when a loaded donkey comes through, which it does, frequently, one of you steps into a doorway and waits. The streets are unpaved except for a few major routes, which means they are dust in summer, which you're in now, and mud in winter, which you're not in yet. And in both cases they are uneven, rutted, occasionally stepped where the slope requires it, and surfaced with the accumulated evidence of everyone who has passed through them carrying things and living their lives. The Athenian street network is not planned in any modern sense. Athens grew the way most ancient cities grew, which is to say it grew around existing paths, existing structures, existing patterns of movement that preceded any formal civic organisation. The grid plan, the orderly arrangement of streets at right angles that the Greek city planner Hippodamus of Miletus will formalise and advocate, and apply to new colonial cities does not apply to Athens. Athens is organic and dense and in places almost labyrinthine, and navigating it requires knowledge rather than logic. You learn the city the way you learn a person, by spending time with it, by making mistakes, by eventually developing a feeling for which turning leads where. The agora opens in front of you, and the agora is the centre of Athenian public life in a way that requires an expanded understanding of what centre means. It is a marketplace, first and most visibly. Fish are the loudest thing here, both in smell and in the volume of commerce around them. The fish sellers are arranged in their stalls and on their portable displays of marble slabs, which keep the fish cooler than the air, and they shout their prices and their freshness and the names of their fish in a way that has made fishmongers a stock comic character in Athenian popular culture for generations. The fish of the Aegean are excellent, plentiful, varied, and deeply integrated into the Athenian diet at every economic level. Salt fish, preserved in clay jars with salt, travels from distant coasts and arrives in the agora from the larger trading boats. Fresh fish comes daily from the coast and from the port at Piraeus, a few miles south, which is connected to Athens by the long walls, those massive defensive structures that make the city and its port a single fortified unit. Tuna, sea bass, grey mullet, anchovies, sea bream, eels from Lake Capes in Boeotia, which are a particular delicacy, enough so that they appear in comedy as objects of longing and excessive expense. Beside the fish are the vegetable sellers, with whatever the season provides. In late summer this means figs, fresh and dried both, grapes, olives, cucumbers, garlic, onions, and the various wild greens that Greek cooking incorporates with the same ease that later Mediterranean cuisines will develop. The garlic is everywhere, not as a flavouring kept in the background but as a primary presence. Greek cooking is built on olive oil, garlic, wine, and herbs, and the garlic's contribution to the agora's atmosphere on a warm morning is not subtle. You will stop smelling it, eventually. Your body will adapt. You already notice that you no longer notice it as immediately as you did when you first arrived, which is either the beginning of integration or the beginning of habituation, and in Athens they are often the same thing. There is also the pottery market, because Athens produces pottery of such quality and in such quantity that it is one of the city's primary export goods. The everyday pottery, the kitchen vessels and storage jars and lamps is plain, functional and good, the clay fired evenly, the shapes well judged, the handles set at the right angle. The finer pottery, the red figure and black figure ware that Athenian workshops produce, is extraordinary, and even ordinary households have a few good pieces. Looking at the pottery on offer in the agora, you can trace the entire visual vocabulary of Athenian life, the myths painted in clean, confident brushwork, the scenes of athletic contest and divine encounter and domestic routine, all of it rendered in the remarkable oxide-based paint that turns red and black in the kiln, through a 3-stage firing process that potters understood completely through practice and not at all through chemistry. The money here is silver and small. The basic unit is the obol, a thin sliver of silver worth roughly what a labourer might earn in an hour, and 6 of them make a drachma. A drachma is a day's wages for a skilled labourer, a significant amount for everyday purchases but not grand. The larger denominations, the tetradrachm and the decadrachm, carry the owl of Athena on one side and her helmeted head on the other, and the Athenian owl coin is one of the most recognised and trusted currencies in the Eastern Mediterranean, accepted from Egypt to the Black Sea ports because Athenian silver, from the mines at Laurion worked by thousands of enslaved people, in conditions that are genuinely terrible, is consistently pure and consistently weighted. You're a man, which in Athens in the 5th century means that the agora belongs to you in a way it does not belong to about half of the free population. Citizen women, the wives and daughters and mothers of citizens, are generally expected to conduct their public life within the domestic sphere, appearing in the agora for specific reasons and specific transactions but not as a general presence. The agora is a male space, the space of democratic participation, commercial exchange and public social life, and the woman who moves through it freely and visibly is announcing something about her social position that places her outside the category of the protected, respectable citizen woman. Foreigners, freedwomen, women who work in commerce, women who do not have the social position that requires the performance of domestic confinement, these women are in the agora, and their presence is unremarkable because it is expected. The citizen woman's absence is equally unremarkable, equally expected, equally enforced not by law, in most cases, but by the social weight of expectation and reputation. This is one of the sharpest edges of Athenian life, and one of the widest gaps between the philosophical reputation of the city and its daily practice. The city that produced Socratic inquiries into the nature of the good, that built a democratic system of remarkable sophistication, that wrote the foundational texts of Western literary and philosophical tradition, organised the lives of its female citizens around a principle of visible absence. The ideal Athenian woman, as expressed in male-authored texts, is one whose name is not spoken in public. The orator Pericles, in his famous funeral speech, tells the widows of the Athenian war dead that the greatest glory they can achieve is to be least spoken of among men, whether for praise or for blame. He means this as a compliment. This is how it was received. The democratic machinery of Athens deserves a moment here, because it operates in the agora in ways that are visible and audible and hard to miss. The courts sit here, or nearby, in open-air spaces under temporary shelters, and trials are public occasions with juries of hundreds of citizens chosen by lot. You can walk past a trial in progress the way you walk past a conversation, and the sound of the advocate speaking, or the witnesses being questioned, or the jury casting their votes with small bronze discs, is part of the texture of the agora. The ecclesia, the citizen assembly, meets on the Nix Hill just southwest of the agora several times a month, and any male citizen can attend and speak and vote on matters of policy, war, treaty, law, and finance. The threshold for attendance is citizenship, which requires Athenian parentage on both sides after Pericles' citizenship law of 451. The threshold for speaking in the assembly is essentially just standing up and waiting for the herald to give you the floor. Democracy here is not a metaphor. It is an activity that happens in specific places at specific times with specific physical procedures, and the places are the agora and the Nix and the hillside courts, and the times are public and regular, and the procedures involve the roll of dice and the casting of votes, and the sound of many hundreds of people either agreeing or expressing disagreement in the traditional Athenian way, which is by shouting. The heat of the day builds from mid-morning onward, and Athens in August is serious about this. The city sits in the Attic plain, surrounded by mountains that hold the heat in during summer, and the combination of limestone and marble and pale plaster that makes Athens so visually dramatic in sunlight also makes it excellent at radiating heat back at you from multiple directions simultaneously. The streets narrow enough to block whatever breeze might exist, the sun high enough to eliminate whatever shade the houses might offer. By noon, the city has arrived at a mutual agreement with the heat that involves everyone slowing down considerably and finding whatever shade exists and not arguing with physics. You eat your midday meal small and without ceremony. Whatever bread and olives and perhaps a piece of dried fish can be managed quickly in the shelter of a doorway or a stall's overhang. The big meal of the day is the deipnon, the dinner, eaten in the early evening when the worst heat has broken and the light has shifted from white and merciless to gold and negotiable. If you're fortunate, the deipnon involves fish cooked in olive oil with garlic and herbs, flat barley bread, perhaps some fresh vegetables, olives, and if the household has been economically successful, or if there has been a recent sacrifice nearby, meat. Meat is not an everyday food for most Athenians. It arrives primarily through the mechanism of sacrifice. Because when an animal is sacrificed to the gods receive the inedible portions, the bones and fat burned on the altar, and the meat goes to the people, distributed to the participants in the ritual and often to the broader community. This is not coincidental. It is one of the ways that religious practice and economic distribution are deeply entangled in Greek life, the temple providing not just divine favour, but animal protein to communities that cannot afford to eat it otherwise. The wine you drink at dinner is always diluted. This is not a personal choice or a moderate preference. It is a categorical social fact. Drinking undiluted wine, akriton, is something that barbarians do, and the word barbarian in Greek means specifically not Greek, derived from the Greek ear's interpretation of foreign languages as a kind of bar, a sound without meaning. Drinking pure wine is not just immoderate by Greek standards, it is un-Greek, a signal of cultural failure. The proper mixing of wine and water, in ratios that vary from 3:1 for light occasions to 2:1 for stronger ones, happens in the large mixing bowl called the crater, and the crater is a social as well as a practical object. A household without a decent crater is making a statement about itself that it probably does not intend to make. The afternoon moves toward evening with the particular quality of summer light in the eastern Mediterranean, that long, slow, golden settling that makes everything look briefly more significant than it actually is. The Acropolis above the city catches this light first and holds it longest. The Parthenon up there on its limestone platform, completed in 438, still new enough to look finished, still sharp-edged, not yet the ruin it will eventually become, still bearing the colours that most people do not know about because they have only seen it white, but which are actually there. The painted friezes and the bright pigments on the metopes and the enormous gilded statue of Athena inside that can be seen from the sea on clear days. The streets quiet in at dusk in a way that requires some getting used to because Athens has essentially no street lighting, and the darkness that falls between the agora closing and the next morning is genuine, thick, interrupted only by the small oil lamps carried by people who need to be somewhere, and the occasional torch at a doorway of someone wealthy enough to maintain one. You learn quickly to carry a lamp if you go out after dark, and to keep the oil topped up, and to know your route well enough to trust your feet when the lamp flickers in the wind. The night city is a different city from the day city, quieter in most places, more specific in others, with its own kinds of commerce and its own kinds of gathering that the day's public visibility does not accommodate. Your body, by the time full night arrives and the lamp on the shelf burns down to a reasonable stopping point, has already been in conversation with you for hours about the adequacy of the mat, the temperature of the room, the particular way that the wooden frame of the sleeping surface has opinions about your lower back. You have been in a city that was simultaneously the most intellectually extraordinary place in the ancient world, and a place where the daily business of staying alive involved garlic and dust and the smell of animals and the sound of 500 citizens shouting their votes and the taste of warm water from a stone basin. Both of these things are equally true. The marble and the mud are the same city. The philosophy and the fish smell are the same morning. This is the part that gets lost in the version with only the columns. You pull the thin blanket over yourself, because even summer nights in Athens have a coolness to them, that Mediterranean shift between day heat and night air that is one of the genuine small pleasures of living in this climate. The sounds of the city have settled into their nighttime frequency, lower, more occasional, the dogs that are everywhere in Athens making their presence known at intervals, the creak of the house settling, the distant sound of someone still moving in the street. Tomorrow the fish will smell again, the garlic will be present, the lottery will decide who manages the courts, and who pours the libations and who gets to speak first in the assembly. The women you will not see in the agora are running the households that make the city function, weaving the cloth and managing the food and raising the children, and exercising the considerable authority that the domestic sphere actually contains, however invisible it is made to appear from the outside. The enslaved people are doing the work that the free people do not wish to do. The philosophers are walking and talking and developing ideas that will be written down and will survive 2,500 years and will still be being discussed in languages that did not exist when they were first spoken. And you're here, on your mat, with your back, in a city that smells like fish and ambition and olive oil, where the distance between the ideal and the actual is not a failure of the ideal, but the basic condition of everything real. Athens is not the postcard. Athens is this: the smell and the heat and the brilliant sky and the complicated people and the genuine, extraordinary, improbable achievement of a city that looked at the world and decided to think about it differently, loudly, publicly, in the agora, between the fish stalls and the pottery market, with the garlic present throughout. Sleep comes, it always does, even in Athens. The gymnasium is another daily reality of Athens that the textbook version tends to leave out, not because it is inappropriate, but because its actual social function is more complex than the simple image of athletic training suggests. The great gymnasia of Athens, the Academy, the Lyceum, and the Kinosages were not just exercise facilities. They were the primary institutions of upper-class male education, the places where boys and young men came not just to exercise their bodies, but to be in the company of older men who would educate them through conversation and example, which is the Greek model of paideia, the formation of the whole person through exposure to people worth emulating. The gymnasium was also, consequently, a space of close social observation and complex erotic attention. Because the Greek understanding of educational relationships between older and younger men, the erastes and the eromenos, the lover and the beloved, intertwined pedagogical mentorship with a form of desire that was understood to be potentially ennobling if managed correctly and potentially destructive if not. This relationship was highly visible and highly regulated by social convention, and the gymnasium was one of its primary settings because the exercise of the body in the presence of others was simultaneously a physical activity and a social performance that invited exactly the kind of appreciative attention that the Greek educational relationship was built around. And if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Understanding this requires setting aside the modern tendency to apply modern categories cleanly to ancient practices, because the ancient Greek understanding of desire and its relationship to education was genuinely different from any modern equivalent, and applying modern labels to it either sanitizes or sensationalizes in ways that both miss the point. What the gymnasium provided was a space where the formation of the young was understood to require the interested attention of their elders, where the body and the mind were not separated, and where the social relationships formed in the process of this formation were among the most consequential relationships of a man's life. Plato's dialogues are full of conversations that begin in the gymnasium, with the specific social texture of the place, the exercise, the oil and dust, the particular quality of attention between the older and younger participants. The philosophy emerges from the gymnasium in the way that the philosophy emerges from the symposium, embedded in a specific social setting rather than occurring in a vacuum. The legal system of Athens was another feature of daily life that the philosophical reputation of the city tends to overshadow in the popular imagination. Athens in the 5th century had a legal system of remarkable sophistication and genuine peculiarity that was, like so much of Athenian life, simultaneously admirable and strange and full of the gap between its theoretical basis and its practical operation. The courts were open to the public. The juries were large, typically 201 or 501 citizens, chosen by lot on the morning of the trial from the pool of eligible citizens who had shown up and registered. There was no professional judiciary. There were no professional judges in the modern sense. The jury was both finder of fact and pronouncer of penalty, and both decisions were made by majority vote after hearing the advocates for both sides speak for timed periods measured by the water clock, the clepsydra. The speeches that survive from Athenian courts, preserved in the manuscript tradition because they were recognized as literary as well as legal documents, give a vivid picture of the rhetorical strategies employed and the arguments made, which range from serious legal reasoning to character assassination to naked appeals to the juror's self-interest, all considered legitimate tools of advocacy in a system that had no formal rules of evidence and that gave the individual advocate enormous latitude in choosing what to say and how to say it. The accusation in Athenian legal practice was private. There was no public prosecutor. Any citizen could bring an accusation against any other citizen, which made the courts available for political attacks dressed as legal actions, for personal vendettas dressed as civic concern, and for the various applications of the legal mechanism to purposes that had nothing to do with the abstract ideal of justice that the institution was theoretically serving. Socrates was convicted in precisely this kind of trial by a narrow majority of a 500-person jury on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth that were political and personal and ideological in their origins, even if they were formally legal in their execution. He died drinking hemlock, the execution method of Athens, which was actually comparatively humane by ancient standards, a slow and relatively painless death by poison, rather than the various more physically violent alternatives available to other ancient societies. This did not make it less of a travesty, but the travesty was inherent in the system rather than exceptional to it, which is the point. The same democratic machinery that voted on war and peace, and the public buildings and the distribution of jury pay voted to execute its most famous philosopher, and it did so by a majority rather than unanimously, which means that 220 citizens or so thought he should not die and still could not save him. The system was what it was, the best available thing and also capable of this simultaneously, as systems always are. The gymnasia's physical culture also supported the military system that Athens depended on, which is worth noting because the relationship between athletic training and military capacity was not accidental but structural. The Athenian hoplite, the citizen soldier who fought in the phalanx formation that was the standard military unit of the classical Greek world, needed to be physically capable of wearing heavy bronze armour and carrying a shield and spear for hours at a time, and the training that the gymnasium provided was a direct input to this military capacity. The connection between citizenship, military service, and physical training was so close in the Greek mind that they were essentially aspects of the same thing. The citizen as a whole person capable of defending his city with his body, as well as deliberating about its future with his mind. The gymnasium and the assembly and the symposium were all part of the same formation, producing the same person, the male citizen of Athens who was simultaneously athlete and soldier, and voter and intellectual, each role supporting and requiring the others. The medicine of Athens deserves its own moment because it is one of the sharpest edges of the contrast between the city's intellectual reputation and the daily physical reality of living in it. Athens in the 5th century is also Athens in the century of Hippocrates of Kos, the figure credited with establishing medicine as a rational discipline distinct from priestly healing, the man whose school produced the texts that form the foundation of the Western medical tradition. The Hippocratic corpus includes detailed observations about disease, careful attention to patient history and symptom progression, and a principled commitment to naturalistic rather than supernatural explanations for illness. This is genuinely remarkable for the ancient world. It is also, in its practical applications, a system that a modern physician would find deeply alarming in its therapeutic interventions. The Hippocratic physicians understood that rest, diet, and time were often the best available medicine for many conditions, and this was actually good advice, considerably better than several of their more active interventions. They observed disease carefully and recorded their observations in a way that is still medically useful, but they also bled patients, purged patients, and applied treatments based on the theory of the 4 humours, which held that the human body contained blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health consisted in their proper balance and illness in their imbalance, and that the physician's task was to restore balance through interventions that adjusted the relative quantities. If you were too full of phlegm, the solution was to reduce phlegm. If you were too heated, you needed cooling. If you were too full of blood, you needed bleeding. The logic was internally consistent. The results were variable in ways that the theory could not account for. The alternative to Hippocratic medicine was temple medicine, specifically the healing sanctuaries of Asclepius, the god of medicine, whose sanctuaries called Asclepiae were the ancient Greek equivalent of hospitals. You arrived at the Asclepiaeon, you performed the preparatory purifications, you fasted and prayed, and then you underwent the enchemesis, the ritual sleep in the sanctuary, during which Asclepius was understood to appear to you in a dream, and either heal you directly or provide instructions for your healing. Patients at the famous Asclepiaeon at Epidaurus left inscribed testimonials of their cures, which have survived, and which describe healings that range from the plausible, a patient with an abscess who had it lanced during the temple sleep and recovered, to the considerably more remarkable, a patient who had been blind for years who saw clearly upon waking. Whether these inscriptions reflect genuine therapeutic outcomes, the placebo effect operating in a ritual context specifically designed to induce it, the selective recording of successes over failures, or some combination of all three, is a question that historians and medical anthropologists find endlessly interesting. What you do if you are sick in Athens in the 5th century, practically and actually, is navigate between these systems according to your resources, your social position, and the nature of your illness. You might call a Hippocratic physician if you can afford one, and if your illness seems like the kind of thing that responds to dietary management and rest. You might go to the Asclepiaeon if the illness is chronic, or if you are the kind of person who finds the ritual sleep more psychologically compelling than the physician's examination. You might do both in sequence, because the ancient Greeks were pragmatic about illness, and did not require that their therapeutic systems be theoretically consistent with each other. What you almost certainly do not do is get the kind of help that a modern emergency room could provide, because that help simply does not exist. Life expectancy numbers for classical Athens, where they can be estimated from skeletal evidence and textual sources, suggest something that looks startling from a modern perspective and was simply reality from an ancient one. Average life expectancy at birth, accounting for the very high rates of infant and child mortality, was somewhere in the range of the mid-20s to mid-30s, which does not mean that most adults died young, but that the deaths of children under 5 were common enough to drag the average dramatically downward. An Athenian who survived childhood and reached adulthood could expect to live into their 50s or 60s in reasonable health if they avoided war, serious accident, and the particular infections that move through crowded urban populations with efficiency. The plague that struck Athens in 430, the plague that killed Pericles, killed so many people so quickly that Thucydides, who survived it and described it in clinical detail, notes that the customary burial rituals broke down because there were not enough living people to perform them properly for all the dead. This is the Athens that Aspasia navigated. This is the Athens where the symposia were held. This is the city that produced the philosophy, which is to say that the philosophy was not produced in spite of the smell and the plague and the short lives and the very limited medical options, but alongside them, in the same city, in the same years, by the same people. The Athenians who debated the nature of the good life and wrote the foundational texts of Western philosophy were people who expected to lose their children at high rates, and who had no reliable way to treat a serious infection. What they had was the present, which is what everyone has, and what they did with the present was remarkable, which is also what people have sometimes done with the present in every era. The slaves deserve a final mention before we leave the streets of Athens, because they are everywhere, and because the standard account of classical Athens tends to treat their presence as a background fact rather than a central one. Athens in the 5th century had an enslaved population that constituted somewhere between a quarter and a third of the total population of Attica. These were human beings who had been purchased, captured in war, born into slavery, or reduced to enslavement through debt or conquest, who did the agricultural labour that fed the city, the mining labour at Laurion that produced the silver that funded the navy, the household labour that freed citizen men for politics and citizen women for domestic management. The Parthenon was built with enslaved labour. The silver that paid for it came from mines where enslaved workers died at rates that were understood to be high and that were managed by replacing workers rather than by reducing the conditions that killed them. The Athenians knew this. They were not unaware of the contradiction between their public ideology of freedom, eleutheria, one of the most frequently deployed concepts in Athenian civic discourse, and the presence of a large enslaved population doing the work that the free population did not wish to do. Aristotle would later attempt to resolve this contradiction by theorizing that some people were naturally suited for the kind of work that required physical labour rather than rational deliberation, which is the kind of philosophical argument that tells you more about what the argument was trying to justify than about the nature of the people it was trying to justify it for. The freedom that Athens celebrated was built on their unfreedom. The democracy that Athens invented excluded them entirely. These are not comfortable facts about a civilization that the Western tradition has consistently celebrated, and they should not be made comfortable. They should be part of the story, because they were part of Athens, as inseparable from it as the Parthenon, and the philosophy, and the kottabos, and the garlic. The thing about Aspasia of Miletus is that she should not have existed, at least not according to the social architecture of classical Athens, not in the form she actually took, not with the visibility she had, the influence she wielded, the name she left in the historical record despite the record being kept almost entirely by men who had complicated feelings about her. She was the wrong kind of person, in the wrong kind of position, in a city that had very definite ideas about what positions were available to whom and why, and she occupied her position anyway, apparently without excessive anxiety about the contradiction. She was born in Miletus, a Greek city on the coast of what is now Western Turkey, sometime in the decade of the 470s before the Common Era, into a cultural environment that was genuinely different from that of mainland Athens. Miletus was a place of multiple layers. It was one of the oldest and wealthiest Greek colonial cities, established early in the age of Greek expansion into the Aegean basin, sitting at the mouth of the Meander River on the edge of the Lydian and then the Persian world. It had absorbed influence from the east in a way that Athens, proud of its Attic roots and suspicious of foreign influence, had not. The philosophers of the Milesian school, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, had done their work here in the generations before Aspasia, establishing a tradition of systematic inquiry into the nature of the world that predates Socrates and Plato by a century. The intellectual atmosphere of Miletus was not identical to that of Athens, and its social atmosphere around educated women appears to have been considerably more permissive. Whether Aspasia came from a family that kept educated hetairai, women companions trained for intellectual and social engagement rather than domestic management, or whether she arrived in Athens with a different status that shifted over time is not settled in the ancient sources. What is clear is that by the time she enters the historical record in any substantial way, she has established herself in Athens as a woman of exceptional rhetorical and intellectual ability, and she has done this in a city that was not organised to accommodate her. The word hetera in ancient Greek means companion, and in Athenian usage it describes a category of women that is genuinely difficult to translate cleanly into modern categories because it contains multitudes. At one level, it means a woman who is not a citizen wife, not domestically confined, not bound by the restrictions of respectability that citizen women navigated, who provides company, conversation, and often physical intimacy to men who are not her husband in exchange for gifts and maintenance. At another level, it means something considerably more elevated, a woman of education and accomplishment who circulates in the intellectual and social world that citizen women were excluded from, who participates in the symposium culture that was the centre of Athenian intellectual life, and whose influence was therefore disproportionate to her official social position precisely because she had access to the rooms where things were actually decided. The hetera was simultaneously outside the respectable social order and inside the spaces of power, and this paradox was not accidental. It was the mechanism by which certain women exercised influence in a city that denied them official channels for it. Aspasia's influence operated through exactly this mechanism, but at an unusually high level. The man she came to be associated with was Pericles, the strategos, the elected military commander who served repeatedly and became effectively the dominant political figure in Athens for several decades in the middle of the 5th century. Pericles was not a king. Athens did not have kings after the Archaic period. What Pericles was a man of sufficient political skill, military reputation, personal charisma, and family connections to be re-elected to the Board of Generals year after year, to be trusted by the assembly with the major decisions of war and peace, and to direct the enormous civic building program on the Acropolis that produced the Parthenon, and the other monuments that still define the visual identity of Athens 2,500 years later. He was the most powerful man in the most powerful city in the Greek world during a period of extraordinary creative and political achievement, and he listened to Aspasia. This alone was outrageous to significant portions of Athenian society, a political leader who consulted a foreign woman who lived with her outside the boundaries of formal Athenian marriage because Pericles' citizenship law of 451 made it legally complicated for a citizen to marry a non-citizen who was seen to value her opinion on matters of policy and rhetoric, was offering a provocation that Athens spent considerable creative energy processing. The comic playwrights, Aristophanes, and the earlier comic poets whose work is preserved only in fragments, returned to Aspasia repeatedly as a subject because she was exactly the kind of target that comedy, which in Athens was a form of social commentary as much as entertainment, was equipped to handle. She was called a Milesian harlot. She was accused of running a brothel from her house, which was also where some of the best intellectual conversation in Athens was being conducted, and the two descriptions were placed side by side as if they were not in tension. The Peloponnesian War, that long grinding conflict between Athens and Sparta that would eventually break Athenian power, was in some comic accounts attributed to her influence, the suggestion being that Pericles had involved Athens in a conflict over the mistreatment of some of her associates or connections. This was not a serious historical claim, it was a joke, which is a particular kind of social pressure. She attracted to her household, or was invited to, the most significant intellectual figures of the age. Socrates himself came. This is documented not in comic exaggeration, but in the philosophical dialogues of both Plato and Xenophon, neither of whom had any particular reason to flatter Aspasia or exaggerate her importance. Plato's dialogue Menexenus has Socrates claiming that she was his teacher in rhetoric, which Plato frames with a degree of irony that historians have been debating ever since, because the dialogue is itself a satirical piece about funeral orations, and whether Socrates is being sincere or performing a kind of elaborate joke at the expense of Athenian political oratory is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that the claim was thinkable. It was not absurd in the way that crediting a specific woman with teaching Socrates rhetoric would be absurd in many other cultures and many other eras. Athens had enough experience of Aspasia's actual rhetorical abilities that the claim, however it was intended, did not disqualify itself by its mere existence. The question of the funeral oration hangs over Aspasia's legacy in a particularly interesting way. The funeral oration delivered by Pericles in 431, at the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War, in honour of the Athenian soldiers who had died in the campaigns of that summer, is one of the most celebrated pieces of political oratory from the ancient world. As recorded by Thucydides, though Thucydides acknowledges that he is giving the general sense rather than the exact words, it presents a vision of Athens as an education to Greece, a democracy that produces free citizens who contribute freely to the common good, a city that is at once open to the world and sufficient unto itself, a model of the good life under good government. It is the kind of speech that gets quoted in introductions to Western political philosophy, and its central claims about democracy and freedom echo through the subsequent tradition in ways that its author could not have anticipated. Ancient sources, including Plato in the Menexenus, suggest that Aspasia drafted it, or wrote it, or contributed substantially to it. The ambiguity in the sources is deliberate, reflecting the discomfort of the claim rather than uncertainty about what was being claimed. Plato's Socrates says he heard the speech from Aspasia and that she composed many of the arguments herself. Whether Plato means this straight, or as a barb aimed at Pericles, suggesting that his famous speech was actually a foreign woman's work, is still argued. The fact remains. The possibility was articulated in writing by a philosopher of the higher stature, and it was not immediately laughed out of the literary tradition. It survived. It is still being discussed. The trial of Aspasia, which ancient sources place around the year 432 or 31, shortly before the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, was the moment when the political pressure that had been building around her and Pericles converged into a formal legal attack. The charges were impiety toward the gods, and in some accounts, procuring free women for Pericles. The impiety charge was the standard all-purpose charge of the Athenian legal system, flexible enough to cover an enormous range of offences from actual religious transgression to simple political inconvenience, and it would later be the same charge used to convict Socrates. It required, by its nature, very little specific evidence, because impiety was a matter of attitude and orientation toward the divine rather than a specific documentable act, and attitude is difficult to disprove. The second charge, about procuring, was almost certainly both exaggerated and politically motivated. It was the kind of charge designed to paint Aspasia's household as a place of vice rather than intellectual engagement, to reduce the sophisticated salon to something disreputable, to give jury members who had no interest in engaging with the philosophical questions a reason to vote for conviction without having to think about the larger issues. Charges of this kind were common in Athenian legal culture, which had a taste for personal attack and was not bound by modern rules of evidence or relevance. Pericles defended her at trial himself. He wept in court. This single detail, preserved by Plutarch writing centuries later, is worth sitting with for a moment, because Pericles was a man famous for emotional control, for the composed, almost marble detachment that made him simultaneously respected and feared. The man Thucydides presents as speaking with such measured authority that the assembly fell quiet for him in a way it did not for others. And here he is, in front of hundreds of citizens serving as jurors, weeping. Ancient sources disagree about exactly what provoked the tears, whether it was the specific arguments being made against her, or simply the weight of her possible loss. Whatever the specific cause, the image of Pericles weeping in public tells you something that the surviving texts rarely tell you directly, which is what Aspasia actually meant to him, and how genuine the relationship was beneath all the political and social noise surrounding it. She was acquitted. The case did not go the way her opponents hoped, which is a small but real fact about Athenian justice in that moment, that a jury of Athenian citizens, the same democratic body that would later execute Socrates, chose in this instance not to convict. What happened to Aspasia in the years that followed is less clearly documented. Pericles died in the plague of 429, in the third year of the Peloponnesian War, in a city under siege, the plague moving through the overcrowded population behind the long walls where the Athenians had retreated from the Spartan invasion of Attica. The plague killed a quarter to a third of the Athenian population. It killed Pericles. Whatever Aspasia felt about this loss is not recorded, because what Aspasia felt about anything is not recorded directly. We have what other people said about her. We do not have what she said about herself. After Pericles, she is associated with a man named Lysicles, a seller of sheep, a man whom the ancient sources describe without flattery as having been of low birth and limited education, who subsequently rose to prominence in Athenian political life and became a general. The credit for his improvement and advancement is given by Plutarch entirely to Aspasia's influence, and while this may be exaggeration, the fact that it was believed that it seemed like the kind of thing Aspasia would do is its own form of evidence about how she was perceived. Even in the later years of her life, even after the death of the man with whom she'd been most publicly associated, she is not described as retreating. She continues. The verb that best applies to Aspasia across all the sources, friendly and hostile alike, is continues. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The absence of her own voice from the historical record is the loss that matters most. She lived in a city that was producing texts at an extraordinary rate, that was writing down philosophy and history and drama and legal arguments and letters with a thoroughness that would preserve those texts across millennia. And still she falls through. What we have is the conversation about her, filtered through people who admired her, feared her, mocked her, learned from her, loved her, and prosecuted her. We do not have her own account of any of it. What that absence tells us is not that she did not exist as a full person, with her own perspective and her own experience and her own account of what it was like to be Aspasia of Miletus in 5th century Athens. It tells us that the archive was not built for her. The texts that survived were written and copied and preserved by people for whom she was a subject rather than a voice. Interesting, fascinating, worth discussing and disputing, but not herself a writer whose words should be transmitted. The gap between her influence and her textual presence is the exact shape of the gap that existed between what Athens said about equality and freedom and what Athens actually practiced when it came to the women and the foreigners and the enslaved people who made the city function. She remained, nevertheless, exactly herself. The city that put Aspasia on trial was also the city that commissioned the Parthenon, whose construction Pericles oversaw during precisely the same years that his relationship with Aspasia was most publicly visible. The Parthenon was built between 447 and 432, the same years that Aspasia was at the height of her influence and the most frequent target of comic attack. The building program that produced the Parthenon and the Propylaea and the Erechtheion and the other structures of the Acropolis was one of the most concentrated achievements of Greek artistic genius, assembled in a single generation at the direction of a single politician, and the question of what Aspasia's role was in the intellectual and aesthetic environment that produced it is not a question that the sources answer directly, but that the circumstantial evidence refuses to leave entirely alone. Pericles' building program was controversial at the time. His political opponents argued that he was spending the money from the Delian League, the alliance that Athens managed, and that was supposed to fund a common Greek defence against Persia, on the glorification of Athens itself rather than the common defence. The argument was not simply that this was politically imprudent, though it was, but that it was dishonest, that Athens was using the Allies' money to dress itself in marble while calling it strategy. Pericles' response, in Thucydides' account, was that Athens had fulfilled its obligations to the alliance and that the surplus was Athens to spend as it chose, which was a defensible position legally and an audacious position morally, and the assembly voted with him. The Parthenon was built. The Allies paid for it, or rather the Allies' contributions paid for it, which is a distinction that the Allies presumably found less than satisfying. The Parthenon's sculptural program, overseen by the sculptor Phidias, was itself subject to attack through Pericles' enemies. Phidias was accused of embezzling gold from the statue of Athena, which he refuted by the simple method of making the gold plates removable and demonstrating that they weighed the amount they were supposed to weigh when removed and weighed. He was then accused of impiety for including portraits of himself and Pericles on the shield of Athena, which was a more serious charge and one that he could not simply weigh his way out of, and he was prosecuted and apparently died in prison or in exile. The attack on Phidias, like the attack on Aspasia, was an attack on Pericles through his associates, a strategy that Athens' political culture had developed into a reliable, if not always successful, tool. Aspasia survived these attacks, Phidias apparently did not. The difference may have been Pericles' willingness to weep in court for Aspasia, and his apparent unwillingness or inability to mount the same defense for his friend. Or it may have been something in the specific charges, or in the specific jury's composition on the specific days of the two trials. The ancient evidence does not allow confident conclusions. What it does allow is the observation that navigating Athenian political life in the age of Pericles required the constant management of enemies who were smart, creative, and willing to use every available mechanism against you, and that both Pericles and Aspasia were doing this navigation successfully for decades, which is itself a form of achievement that the historical record does not fully credit, because it leaves no physical monument, only the continued presence of the people doing the navigating. The Peloponnesian War, which broke out in 431 and ran with varying intensity until 404, was the context in which Aspasia spent the second half of her public life. The war between Athens and Sparta and their respective allies was the dominant fact of Greek political life for most of a generation, and its consequences were catastrophic for Athens in ways that Pericles' funeral oration, delivered in the war's first year, could not have anticipated. The plague came in the second year and killed Pericles and a quarter of the city. The Sicilian expedition of 415 to 413, the most ambitious military operation Athens had ever attempted, ended in the total destruction of the Athenian forces. The city fought on for another decade through a combination of pride and desperation, and the remarkable resilience of its democratic institutions, which survived oligarchic coups and continued to function until the final defeat in 404. Aspasia watched all of this and survived most of it, which in itself says something about the quality of her judgment and her ability to navigate circumstances that destroyed others. She had the advantage of not being directly exposed to the military disasters that killed so many Athenian men. She had the disadvantage of having been closely associated with the political leadership that presided over the war's opening years, which made her a convenient focus for the resentment and grief of a city losing its children to a war it was beginning to question the wisdom of. That she continued to have a life, to influence events through her relationship with Lysicles, to be remembered as a significant figure even after Pericles' death, suggests a capacity for survival that goes beyond luck and implies something about how she was understood and valued even by people who did not necessarily approve of her. The intellectual world that Aspasia inhabited was organised around questions that the 5th century had inherited from the generation before and was transforming. The earlier Greek philosophical tradition, associated with the Milesian school and the pre-Socratic thinkers, had been primarily concerned with questions about the fundamental nature of the physical world. What is everything made of? What is the underlying substance of reality? Thales said, water. Anaximenes said, air. Heraclitus said the logos, the rational principle of change. These questions were systematic and serious, and represent the beginning of something important in the history of thought, but they were not the questions that Athens in the 5th century was most urgently interested in. Athens in the 5th century was interested in human beings, in how they should live, how they should govern themselves, what virtue was and whether it could be taught, and what happened when clever people reached different conclusions about it. The shift from cosmological philosophy to ethical and political philosophy is also a shift in the social location of philosophical inquiry. Philosophy in the pre-Socratic tradition was conducted by individual thinkers in relative isolation or in small schools. Philosophy in the Socratic mode was conducted in the agora, in the street, in the gymnasia, in the symposia, in the middle of daily life, by a man who claimed to know nothing and demonstrated this by asking everyone around him increasingly uncomfortable questions about what they did know, which turned out to be less than they thought. Aspasia was part of this world, and the kind of philosophy being practiced there was precisely the kind that required interlocutors rather than isolated contemplation. The Socratic method is a conversation. It produces nothing unless someone is willing to engage, to answer the questions, to follow the argument wherever it leads, even when it leads to the embarrassing admission that you have been wrong about something you were confident about. The symposium was one of the primary venues for this kind of engagement, and Aspasia was in the symposia, and Socrates was in the symposia, and the conversation that Plato later transcribed and attributed to both of them is not an invention out of nothing but a representation of a mode of interaction that was real. The question of what Aspasia actually thought, what position she took, what arguments she made, is permanently inaccessible to us because her own writing does not survive, if she wrote anything at all, and we cannot assume she wrote anything because women who wrote in the ancient world are exceptional rather than typical. What we have are the reports of others, and those reports are consistent in a way that is itself informative. She is reported to have been persuasive, to have argued well, to have had positions that she defended with skill. She's reported to have influenced Pericles' political thinking, and to have been consulted by him on matters of policy. She's reported to have had views about the education of children and about rhetoric and about the conduct of public affairs. All of these reports, whatever their individual reliability, converge on a picture of a person who was thinking actively and seriously about the same questions that everyone in her intellectual circle was thinking about. The Socratic position on women's intellectual capacity was complicated by the standards of his time, which is not the same as saying it was progressive by modern standards, but is worth noting. Socrates, in several of the Platonic dialogues, suggests that virtue is the same for men and women, that the capacity for knowledge and goodness does not differ by sex. He says this while living in a city that organises its entire social structure around a different assumption, and the tension between the philosophical position and the social reality is one that the dialogues acknowledge without resolving. Philosophy as Socrates practiced it needed people willing to argue, willing to be questioned, willing to follow ideas to their destinations. The domestic confinement of citizen women removed them from this practice entirely. Aspasia's status as a foreign woman gave her access to the practice, whether this represents a form of freedom or a different form of constraint. Being acceptable in the public intellectual world precisely because you are categorized as not entirely respectable is a question that the sources do not address, and that her successors in later centuries have addressed in various ways. The particular cruelty of her historical position is not that she was unsuccessful or powerless in her own time, it is that the archive was not built for her. The texts that survived were written and copied and preserved by people for whom she was a subject rather than a voice, interesting, fascinating, worth discussing and disputing, but not herself, a writer whose words should be transmitted. The gap between her influence and her textual presence is the exact shape of the gap that existed between what Athens said about equality and freedom and what Athens actually practiced when it came to the women and the foreigners and the enslaved people who made the city function. She remained nevertheless exactly herself, and the continuation is the most consistent fact about her. Hat is the thing that is hardest to dismiss and most worth preserving. There is a version of the symposium that has made it into the popular imagination, and it is, if not exactly wrong, significantly incomplete in ways that matter. The refined image is this: beautiful torchlit room, cushioned couches arranged along the walls, handsome men in fresh chitons reclining at ease, wine cups catching the light, serious conversation about love or beauty or the right way to live drifting elegantly through an atmosphere of cultivated pleasure. It sounds like a civilized evening. It looks like philosophy made social. It is, on the evidence, this and also considerably more complicated, and the complications begin before you have even walked through the door. You have been invited to a symposium tonight, and you have spent some portion of the afternoon preparing for it in ways that would not be immediately obvious to an observer, but that carry genuine social weight. You have bathed, or at least washed carefully, using the cold water from the basin and the strigil, the curved bronze scraper that you use to remove the oil and sweat and dust from your skin, because the strigil and oil system of bodily cleanliness is what Athens uses in the absence of soap, and it works reasonably well when performed with sufficient attention. You have applied fresh olive oil after scraping, because in this climate and with this level of dust in the air, dry skin is uncomfortable and also socially visible, and the olive oil serves as both moisturizer and mild fragrance. You have put on your better chiton, the finer linen one rather than the everyday wool, and pinned it more carefully, and arranged the belt with more attention. You have, in short, made yourself into someone who is going to a symposium, rather than someone who has been walking around Athens all day, and in Athens these are genuinely different versions of the same person. The walk to the host's house in the narrow streets after dark involves the small oil lamp, its flame cupped against the evening breeze, casting a circle of warm light that moves with you and reveals the street in installments, 10 paces ahead at most, the rest darkness and sound and the knowledge of the city that you carry in your feet from having walked it by day. The city at night is quieter than by day, but not silent, and navigating it requires the kind of relaxed attention that comes from familiarity. Strangers in Athens after dark are a problem. You are not a stranger. You know this street. You take the turning correctly. The house is already lit when you arrive, lamplight in the courtyard visible over the wall, and the sound of voices low and social reaching you from inside. You arrive at the door and the slave who answers it is expecting guests and shows you through the courtyard to the andron. The andron is the room you need to understand. This is the men's room, the formal reception room of the Athenian house, and it is distinguished from the rest of the structure in several ways that signal its purpose. The floor is raised slightly, a platform that runs along the walls and accommodates the clinae, the couches, arranged in a continuous U around the room. The floor in the centre, the unraised portion, is sometimes mosaic, sometimes painted stucco, sometimes good tile, but it's notably finer than the floors of the rest of the house, because the andron is a performance space. It is where the household presents itself to the world outside the household, where hospitality is demonstrated and social standing is confirmed, and the carefully managed front face of Athenian domestic life is most carefully maintained. Everything about the andron is intended to communicate that the person who owns this house knows what he is doing. The couches are the primary furniture. Each one can accommodate two people reclining at a slight diagonal, heads toward the centre of the room, feet toward the wall, with a small low table beside it for the cups and food. There are cushions in various states of quality depending on the household's resources. There is a lampstand with multiple lamps burning, the smell of olive oil and wick faint but continuous in the air. There are the other guests already arranged on their couches, already in conversation. Your sandals go by the door. This is the first thing, the removal of shoes before entering the andron. The sandals have been on the Athenian street all day. The Athenian street is what you already know it to be. The floor of the andron has been washed and is scattered with aromatic herbs, thyme and bay and something else, dried and slightly sweet that you can smell under your feet when you step on it. The contrast is immediate and real, and you understand it the same way you understand the good floor and the careful lamps, which is as a statement about this space being different from the space outside. You are entering a constructed environment. The rules outside do not entirely apply in here. A slave comes with a basin for your hands, warm water this time, scented faintly with something, and you wash, and the act of washing is both practical and ceremonial, a transition gesture that says you are ready to be here, ready to participate in what is about to happen. Then the head wreath, placed on your head by the host or by a slave at the host's direction, a circlet of myrtle or ivy or seasonal flowers woven together, fragrant and slightly awkward and absolutely required, because the head wreath is the symposium's visual grammar. It marks you as a participant. It announces that the ordinary rules are suspended in favour of the symposium's rules, which are different. The wreath is not decorative, it is a uniform. The host assigns you your couch, or indicates where you may choose. The arrangement of couches is social geometry. The host's position is established. The places nearest the host are for the most honoured or most intimate guests. The places furthest are for the newest or least established. You find your place, which is neither the worst nor the best position, and you arrange yourself on the couch in the reclining position, which involves propping yourself on the left elbow with the left forearm flat on the cushion, the body along the length of the couch, the right hand free for the cup. This posture, the reclining on the left elbow, is the symposium's signature physical vocabulary, so characteristic that it appears on the pottery in exactly this pose across hundreds of surviving pieces. You are now, physically, in the symposium posture. You look like a person at a symposium. This is the first step. The wine is prepared in the crater. The crater stands near the centre of the room, a large mixing vessel, bronze or painted clay depending on the household's resources, and into it go the wine and the water in the evening's chosen ratio. Before any drinking begins, 3 libations are poured. This is not optional, and it is not performed quickly or without attention. The first is for the Olympian gods, the 12 who inhabit the upper air and the high places, who oversee the broad sweep of things. The second is for the heroes, the semi-divine figures who connect the divine world to the human one, who died as mortals but were honoured as more than mortal, whose presence is invoked as a bridge. The third is for Zeus the Saviour, the particular aspect of the king of the gods that pertains to right endings, safe returns, good outcomes. You pour the libation with the others, you speak the brief formulas, and you mean them in the way that people mean things when they live in a world where the divine is present and immediate and genuinely matters, not metaphorically but practically, in the way that weather matters and illness matters and the outcome of wars matters. Then the election of the symposiarch. The symposiarch is the master of the evening's drinking, the person who sets the ratio of water to wine, determines the order of entertainment and conversation, establishes the evening's themes if it has them, and can impose forfeits and penalties on guests who break the rules of the evening. The symposiarch is chosen in various ways depending on the host and the occasion, sometimes by the host's personal appointment of the guest he wishes to honour, sometimes by the role of a knucklebone or a die, the random element entering the symposium as it enters civic life, because Athens has a deep and principled suspicion of allowing any single person too much unchecked authority, and even the master of the evening's drinks is sometimes best determined by chance rather than by the inevitable politics of preference. Tonight the die rolls, the symposiarch is chosen. He sets the ratio at somewhere between 2:1 and 3:1 water to wine, which means an evening that will move but not sprint. You make your note of this and calibrate your approach to the cup accordingly. The entertainment begins, and here is where the standard image of the symposium becomes significantly incomplete, because the entertainment is not something that happens to you. You are the entertainment. All of you, all the guests on all the couches, are expected to contribute to the evening's content, and the expectation is not gentle or optional. The symposium is a practice space for the kind of educated sociability that Athenian men were supposed to embody, which means it involves performance, and the performance is evaluated by the people watching it in real time, in the way that all public performance is evaluated, through the quality of attention it receives and the response it generates. What you might be asked to perform is various. You might be expected to sing, which in Athens means singing lyric poetry to the accompaniment of the aulos, the double-reed woodwind instrument played by a professional flute girl if the household has engaged one, or to a simpler accompaniment from another guest, or unaccompanied if the occasion is more intimate. The singing of lyric poetry at symposia is not casual background entertainment. It is a demonstration of cultural competence. The poems that circulate at symposia are the canonical lyric poems of the Greek tradition, Homer for epic recitation, but Alcaeus, Ibycus, Anacreon, Simonides, and Sappho for the lyric form appropriate to the symposium setting. These poems are known, they are memorized, they are shared like a common language among educated Athenian men, and the ability to sing a piece correctly, to render the meter and the meaning and the emotional quality of the poem with skill, says something specific and significant about the kind of education you received and the kind of person you have become. Sappho appears here with a frequency that surprises people who know Sappho primarily as a figure of later romantic or feminist appropriation. In classical Athens, Sappho of Lesbos is simply one of the poets, the way Homer is one of the poets, not specialized or niche or controversial, but canonical, ranked by ancient Greek literary critics alongside the greatest names without hesitation. The ancient world calls her the 10th muse. Her poems circulate in manuscript and in memory, and in the oral tradition of the symposium for centuries after her death. A man at an Athenian symposium who cannot recognize a sapphic stanza and respond to it appropriately is demonstrating a cultural gap that other guests will notice and may or may not mention aloud, depending on the mood of the evening and the kindness of the symposiarch. You know your poetry. You have been preparing specifically and deliberately, because arriving at a symposium without material is the equivalent of arriving at a modern professional event without the ability to discuss your field. The preparation involved not just memorizing the words, but internalizing the quality of them, the particular flavor of Alcaeus' political energy, or Anacreon's gentle hedonism, or Simonides' melancholy about the passing of things, because the performance at a symposium is not recitation in the flat sense of words in the right order. It is interpretation, delivery, the expression of genuine engagement with the material, and the room knows the difference. Between performances there is conversation, and the conversation at a symposium is also not casual in the way that conversation between acquaintances is casual. It has a structure, an expectation of wit and weight, a sense that the evening's discussion should arrive somewhere rather than simply pass time. Topics move across a wide range. Myths retold from new angles, philosophical positions proposed and challenged, political arguments made with enough indirection to be safe, stories of the Persian Wars that are still recent enough to be personal memory for older men in the room. observations about the nature of beauty and desire and what it means to want something you cannot entirely possess, which is a theme that Greek lyric poetry has been exploring for centuries because it turns out to be one of the permanent conditions of human experience, and the symposium is where that exploration is conducted in miniature, among people who have been educated to think about it carefully. Riddles circulate. This is not a children's entertainment in the Athenian context, but a form of intellectual play that tests quickness of mind and the ability to hold multiple meanings simultaneously. A good riddle at a symposium demonstrates the same quality that good rhetoric or good poetry demonstrates, the ability to work in the space between what is said and what is meant, to make language do more than one thing at once. Athens is a city in love with this double register, with irony and indirection, and the use of oblique means to arrive at direct effects, and the riddle is one of its simplest expressions. And then if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. And then there is Kottabos. Kottabos is the drinking game of the Athenian symposium, and it is described by the ancient sources with the same enthusiasm that people apply to any game they genuinely enjoy, which means it appears in the poetry, in the comedy, on the pottery, in the accounts of parties, and in a surprising number of contexts where you might not expect to find a game involving wine and hand-eye coordination. The basic mechanic is simple. You hold your wine cup, a shallow flat-handled vessel called a kylix, by one finger through the handle, swing your wrist with a specific motion that flicks the dregs of wine out of the cup, and aim at a target. The targets vary by version: a disc balanced on top of a pole in the centre of the room that must be knocked off, or small saucers floating in a bowl of water that must be sunk, or a simpler arrangement of a flat basin that must be hit. There are prizes, there are forfeits. The game scales with the amount of wine already consumed, which is its appeal, because as the evening progresses the challenge remains consistent, while the ability to meet it declines at a pace that produces both comedy and genuine contest. What makes Kottabos specifically interesting is the cultural weight it carries beyond being a game. It is associated in the poetry and the art with romantic longing. When you flick the dregs of your wine at the target, you're supposed to name the person you desire, and a successful hit means your feelings are returned or your suit will prosper. A bit of romantic fortune-telling embedded in the mechanics of a drinking game, which tells you something about the way the symposium blends intellectual content with emotional content with playful content in ways that resist the clean separations a modern audience might want to impose. The night deepens, the lamps have been refilled at least once, several rounds of wine have been consumed, the head wreaths are still on, or some of them are, or one has been placed on the lampstand as a mild joke about the owner's current relationship with propriety, which has softened as the evening progressed. The conversation has moved through several distinct phases, lighter at the beginning, heavier in the middle, and now in the later hours settling into something personal and reflective, the kind of talk that only happens at this hour and in this degree of comfortable undoneness, where the performance quality of earlier in the evening has given way to something more direct. You have held your own. Not brilliantly, not in a way that will be talked about, but adequately, which in Athens at a symposium is not nothing. You have sung your piece without visible uncertainty. You have said something genuinely interesting about one of the riddles, something that made the person on the next couch look over with real attention. You have played Kottabos and hit the target once out of 3 attempts, which is respectable given the hour and the wine. You have listened at least as much as you have spoken, which is itself a form of competence, because Athens is a city that knows the difference between a person who listens and a person who is just waiting to speak. The symposiarch declares the evening complete. There are the closing libations, because there are always libations, because the gods were present at the opening and should be acknowledged at the closing, and this is not formality but practice. You put on your sandals at the door. The night air is cooler now than when you arrived. That quality of Mediterranean summer nights that makes the darkness feel benevolent after the long day's heat. The walk home is quiet. Your lamp is low on oil. The streets are empty except for you and the occasional dog and the sound of the city in its nighttime mode, which is mostly breathing, mostly still, mostly the accumulated exhale of a population that has been at it since before dawn and is finally briefly not. You did the thing, you were in the room. You held the wine and wore the wreath and said the right words at the right times and flicked the dregs of the kylix with the specific wrist motion that this city considers both a game and a small ritual of longing. The conversation moved and you moved with it. The evening had the particular quality that Athenian men invested enormous cultural energy in producing, the sense of a shared space where ordinary rules were loosened just enough to allow genuine exchange, genuine play, genuine encounter with ideas and with other people in something approaching their full complexity. Tomorrow the agora, today was the symposium. The Eleusinian mysteries deserve particular attention in any account of Greek sanctuary life, because they represent the most significant and most secretive of the Greek religious institutions, and the one whose gap between external image and internal reality is most completely preserved by the ancient sources, which is to say, preserved as a blank, as an absence, as a space that the sources carefully avoid filling in. The mysteries at Eleusis, a town about 15 miles northwest of Athens, were connected to the cult of Demeter and Persephone, and involved a secret initiation ritual whose precise content was so successfully kept from the uninitiated that it remains unknown despite centuries of ancient speculation and modern scholarship. What we know is structural. The initiates travelled from Athens to Eleusis in a great procession, the Iacchus procession, in late September or early October, through a ritual landscape of sacred stops and ceremonies that prepared them psychologically for the initiation itself. They spent the night in the Telesterion, the great hall at Eleusis, built to accommodate thousands of initiates simultaneously, and there something happened, something that ancient descriptions characterize in terms of its psychological effect rather than its content. People emerged from the Telesterion changed. Ancient writers who were themselves initiates, and who therefore knew exactly what had happened, described the experience in terms of transformation, of a new relationship to mortality and to what lay beyond it, of a peace with the fact of death that they had not possessed before. Cicero, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, says that the mysteries had taught him not only to live joyfully, but to die with better hope. What happened in the Telesterion was protected by a prohibition so seriously observed that in the entire ancient record there are only a small number of accounts of people revealing the mysteries, and those accounts are of prosecutions or escapes from prosecution rather than actual revelations, because the revelations themselves were not made public even when the revealer was being punished. The content of the mysteries is still not definitively known, despite the work of generations of classical scholars. Various theories have been proposed involving ritual drama of the Persephone myth, the display of sacred objects, the consumption of a grain-based drink called kykeon, that may have contained ergot or other psychoactive compounds, and various combinations of these. None of the theories is conclusively supported by the evidence, because the evidence is precisely what the ancient world chose not to preserve. This is the most extreme version of the gap between the external image and the internal reality of the Greek sanctuary, because in this case the internal reality was successfully concealed and remains concealed. The sanctuary at Eleusis presented an external image of purification, procession, and the agricultural cycle of death and renewal. Whatever the internal reality was, it produced the psychological effects that ancient witnesses describe, effects powerful enough that people travelled from across the ancient world to experience them and maintain their silence about the content for centuries. The sanctuary system was capable, in this instance, of creating and protecting a genuine mystery, which is perhaps the most human thing about it, the evidence that the institutional machinery could sometimes, in the right circumstances, actually deliver what it promised. The Dionysian traditions deserve attention too, as a counterpoint to the Apollonian clarity and order that the major Panhellenic sanctuaries projected. The cult of Dionysus, the god of wine and transformation and ecstatic dissolution, operated at the edge of the civic religious system in ways that were officially sanctioned and yet perpetually uncomfortable for the authorities who sanctioned them. The Dionysian festivals, the Lenaea and the Dionysia, were major civic occasions in Athens, the occasions for the dramatic performances that produced the great tragedies and comedies of the classical period, and they were thoroughly institutionalized, managed by city officials, funded by wealthy citizens performing the liturgy of Chorogos, supporting the dramatic chorus as a public contribution to the city's religious life. But the Dionysian tradition also included the Maenads, the female devotees of Dionysus, who were understood in myth to experience a form of religious ecstasy that involved leaving their homes, going into the mountains, and engaging in wild dances and rituals that suspended ordinary social categories. The maenads appear on the pottery in their characteristic pose, heads thrown back, dressed in fawn skins, carrying the Thyrsos staff wound with ivy, in states that represent the temporary dissolution of the self into the divine possession of the god. Whether historical women actually went into the mountains in the grip of Dionysian ecstasy, or whether the maenad was primarily a mythological and artistic figure rather than a social reality, is debated. What is not debated is that the Dionysian tradition represented within the official religious calendar of Athens an acknowledged space for the suspension of ordinary rules, a sanctioned occasion for behaviour that ordinary Athenian life did not permit, and that this space was occupied primarily by women, at least in the mythology, which is its own kind of comment on what the city understood women to need that the ordinary social structure was not providing. The music at the symposium requires more attention than it usually gets, because music in ancient Athens is not background. It is not ambient atmosphere. It is embedded in the culture in a way that makes it central to Athenian civic identity, and the symposium is the most important venue for the transmission and performance of musical culture outside the formal public festivals. The Greeks divided music into modes, which they understood not just as patterns of intervals, but as having specific emotional and ethical characters. The Dorian mode was associated with courage, gravity, and moral seriousness. The Phrygian mode was associated with enthusiasm and passion, the mode of the Dionysian rites. The Lydian mode was associated with softness and comfort, a certain luxurious sensibility that Greek moralists viewed with suspicion. Plato, in the Republic, wants to eliminate the soft modes from the ideal city because he believes they incline the soul toward weakness. And while this position is more extreme than general Athenian practice, it reflects a widespread conviction that music was not a neutral aesthetic experience, but an active force that shaped the character of those who listened to it and performed it. The aulos, the double-reed woodwind instrument that is the primary melody instrument of the symposium, is played by a professional, typically a woman hired for the evening, an aulitress, whose presence at the symposium is itself socially complex because she is present in a male space not as a guest but as a worker. The aulos produces a penetrating, somewhat nasal tone that ancient descriptions suggest was quite loud relative to the intimate scale of the andron, and the combination of the instrument's character with the mode being played and the poetry being sung created the specific sonic experience that the Greeks understood as the atmosphere of the symposium, identifiable, intentional, and freighted with meaning. The lyre, the kithara in its larger concert form, is the instrument associated with Apollo and with the more elevated, formal end of Greek musical culture. The solo lyre performance represented the peak of Greek musical ambition. At a private symposium, the lyre might be played by a guest who had genuine musical training, and this was a form of social distinction, because the ability to play the lyre well was part of the education of aristocratic boys, in a way that the ability to play the aulos was not. The aulos was associated with artisanal professionals. The lyre was associated with gentlemen. This distinction reflects a broader Greek attitude towards skilled craft that associated it with a kind of limitation that made it unsuitable for citizens who aspired to full civic life, and playing the aulos was a craft skill while playing the lyre was the skill of an educated person. And the difference between them was not about the sounds they produced, but about what they said about the person producing them. The poetry performed at the symposium circulated through a culture that was partly written and partly oral, in a way that the modern world has largely lost. The great Homeric epics existed in written form by the 5th century, but were also still live in an oral tradition of performance by specialist rhapsodes who performed them at festivals and competitions. The lyric poems of Sappho and Alcaeus and the others were written down on papyrus rolls kept in private libraries, and were also memorized and performed and transmitted orally through the symposium tradition. A poem by Sappho, performed at a symposium in Athens, was not a literary quotation from the past, but a living piece of culture being actively transmitted through the act of performance, the way a folk song is transmitted through doing rather than through reading. This living quality of the literary tradition meant that the symposium was genuinely a site of cultural reproduction and transmission. The young men at the symposium were learning what the culture valued by participating in the performance of it, by absorbing through practice what the older members of the culture had absorbed through their own earlier participation. The head wreath and the reclining posture and the diluted wine and the specific mode the aulos was playing were all part of a package of cultural formation transmitted through the symposium in a way that no other institution replicated. The conversation about love at the symposium was similarly structured and similarly consequential. The Greeks had a sophisticated and carefully theorized understanding of eros, of desire, that was different from modern understandings in important ways, and that the symposium was the primary venue for exploring. The relationship that Plato would later analyse at length in his dialogue called the Symposium, between an older man of wisdom and a younger man of beauty, the erotic relationship that was also a pedagogical relationship. The idea that desire could be a vehicle for philosophical growth if properly managed was a live and contested topic in Athenian intellectual life. The Symposium was where these ideas were tested against experience and against argument, where the claim that eros could be ennobling was evaluated by people who had personal experience of it, and who brought that experience into conversation with the philosophical positions being articulated. Author Athens, both are necessary. The city would not be what it is without either of them. The great sanctuaries of the ancient Greek world presented one of the most carefully maintained images in the ancient Mediterranean. Approach the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi and you are ascending his sacred way, lined with treasuries and offerings, and the accumulated commemorative architecture of centuries, the whole site organised around the temple at its heart, with a precision that suggests the divine geometry is not accidental, but built in. The sanctuary at Olympia, set in its green valley between the Alpheos and Cladios rivers, presented at festival time a spectacle of ordered ritual, athletic contest conducted in honour of Zeus, and crowds of visitors from across the Greek world gathered in a spirit of pan-Hellenic unity that the festival was explicitly designed to create and sustain. These were sacred spaces, inviolable in principle, removed from the ordinary commerce of the world by the divine protection that the gods extended to their own precincts. This image was real, in the sense that it was genuinely experienced and genuinely meant. The ancient Greeks were not performing piety. Their relationship with their gods was immediate, daily, embedded in the routines of cooking and travel and warfare and agriculture in ways that made the divine a practical presence rather than a ceremonial abstraction. The sanctuaries were real meeting points between the human and the divine, and the rituals performed there were understood to have genuine consequence, to affect the relationship between mortals and immortals in ways that mattered for the outcomes of war and harvest and illness and birth. But the sanctuaries were also institutions, and institutions are run by people, and people have interests that do not always align with the official purpose of the institution they manage. The gap between the image of the sanctuary and its operational reality is not a gap between sincerity and deception. It is a gap between the ideal that any institution projects and the human reality of how it functions on the ground, in the daily negotiations between sacred purpose and practical necessity. Begin with the sanctuaries were rich, extremely rich. This was not an accident or a side effect. It was the intended outcome of a religious system in which giving to the gods was both pious and, in the ancient Greek understanding of divine reciprocity, strategically sensible. The gods protected those who honoured them appropriately, and appropriate honour included material gifts of genuine value. City-states that won battles dedicated a share of the spoils to the deity, whose favour had presumably contributed to the victory. Individuals who recovered from illness, survived storms at sea, won at the games, produced healthy children, or avoided some disaster that they attributed to divine intervention, left commemorative dedications at the relevant sanctuary, small bronze figurines, terracotta votive objects, weapons, jewellery, elaborate bronze and silver vessels, and in the case of the very wealthy, life-size bronze statues and even small buildings. The accumulation of these gifts at the major Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries over centuries created repositories of wealth that were extraordinary by any ancient standard. The sanctuary at Delphi had multiple treasury buildings, each one constructed by a different city-state specifically to house that city's dedications, physically advertising the city's piety and prosperity in a built-form competition that lined the sacred way from the entrance to the temple. The treasury of the Siphnians, built in the late 6th century when Siphnos was at the peak of its silver mining wealth, was decorated with a carved frieze of such quality that it rivals the best sculpture in the Greek world. These buildings were not just storage, they were statements. The sacred site was also a gallery of competitive civic self-presentation, and the art and architecture deployed in it were among the finest that Greek culture produced. The official theology held that the wealth in the treasuries was sacred, belonging to the god, inviolable, protected by divine sanction against any human appropriation. In practice, the wealth was borrowed, repeatedly by city-states that found themselves in financial emergencies and that had a convenient relationship with the sanctuary authorities, who were typically prominent citizens of the borrowing city or of nearby cities with strong ties to the sanctuary management. Athens borrowed from the treasury of Athena on the Acropolis during the Peloponnesian War, when the financial demands of fighting a long, expensive conflict strained the city's resources. The records of these loans are preserved on inscriptions and are matter-of-fact in their accounting, stating the amounts, the interest rates, and the repayment schedules, because the sacred funds were borrowed with interest, which raises its own theological questions about the divine economy that the ancient sources do not address with the directness one might hope for. The Spartans, fighting their own wars with their own resource constraints, made use of temple funds under formulations that were sufficiently oblique to avoid the worst implications of the word theft, without quite constituting the word loan. The Persian king Xerxes, during his invasion of Greece in 480, looted several sanctuaries, and the Greek horror at this violation was genuine and deep, the act understood as a profound impiety that would eventually draw divine punishment. The difference between a Persian king taking temple wealth and an Athenian democracy borrowing it at interest is real, in terms of both the relationship to the divine and the intent of the actors, but it is smaller than the official theology of inviolability would suggest, and the Greeks of the period were aware of this, even if they did not discuss it at the formal level of institutional statement. The oracle at Delphi warrants particular attention because it illuminates the gap between the image and the operational reality with a clarity that makes the gap itself visible. The official image of Delphic consultation was this. The priestess of Apollo, the Pythia, sat on her sacred tripod above a chasm in the living rock of the earth, through which arose vapours of divine origin, and in this state of divine inspiration she spoke the words of the god himself. Petitioners came from across the Greek world and beyond it, from the Greek colonial cities of the western Mediterranean and the Black Sea coast, from Lydia and from Persia and from Egypt, because the oracle's reputation for accuracy and for the divine authority behind its pronouncements was understood across the ancient world as one of the most reliable available sources of guidance about the future and about divine will. Kings consulted it before wars, city-states consulted it before founding new colonies or making major constitutional changes. Individuals consulted it about marriage and illness and business and the proper way to handle a corpse that had been found on your property, because Greek religious practice had detailed ritual requirements for situations of this kind, and the oracle could be consulted on whether they had been met. The operational reality was considerably more earthly, without this necessarily making it false. The consultation process was managed by a college of priests, male priests despite the female Pythia, who oversaw every aspect of the visitor's experience from arrival to departure. The first step was payment. The fee was called the palanos, and it was substantial and it was graduated, meaning that individuals paid less than city-states, and city-states paid less than kings, and the fee schedule was known and understood to be required before consultation could proceed. This was not secret. It was part of the mechanism. The god's advice was available to everyone in principle, but in practice it was available to everyone who could afford the appropriate preparation. The preparation also included preliminary sacrificial animals, provided and assessed by the sanctuary's priests, who examined the victim for favourable omens before the consultation could proceed. An unfavourable victim meant the consultation was postponed, or that additional offerings were required. This element of the process gave the priest a degree of control over the timing and sequencing of consultations that is worth noting, because it meant that the order in which petitioners were seen, the urgency or delay applied to different queries, and the general management of the consultation calendar was in priestly hands. The god's accessibility was organised by human administrators, and human administrators have professional judgment about when and how things should happen. The Pythia herself, whatever the precise nature of her inspired state, which scholars have debated for 2 centuries, and which recent geological investigation suggests may have involved genuine intoxicating vapours from hydrocarbon-rich rock formations beneath the temple, spoke in responses that were then interpreted or transcribed by the priests. the famous ambiguity of Delphic oracles, the quality that made it possible for them to be interpreted as correct, regardless of what actually happened, was a genuine feature of the responses rather than a modern projection. The oracle told Croesus of Lydia that if he crossed the Halys River and attacked Persia, he would destroy a great empire. He crossed, and he was destroyed himself. The empire he destroyed was his own. The oracle was not wrong. The interpretation was. This is a famous story, and its fame reflects how widely understood this quality of Delphic responses was in the ancient world. What scholarship has also noted is that the priests of Delphi were exceptionally well informed. Delphi was a crossroads, the site of the most important oracle in the Greek world, which meant that visitors arrived from every major city-state, every Greek colony, and many foreign kingdoms, bringing with them the political and military intelligence of their home regions. In the process, if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. In the process of arriving, preparing for consultation, waiting their turn, speaking with the priests about the nature of their question, and generally being people who could not entirely suppress the human tendency to explain their situation, these visitors constituted a continuous stream of high-quality information about the state of the Greek world and its neighbours. The priests had access to intelligence networks that no single state possessed. Their knowledge of what was likely to happen, informed by knowledge of what every major player was planning and what resources they commanded, was the kind of knowledge that could produce responses with a very high hit rate without any supernatural element being required. None of this means the Pythia was simply performing. The ancient Greeks did not separate the human and divine in the way this framing implies. A priest who was well informed could speak with divine guidance through that information. The two were not in opposition. But the operational reality of the oracle, as an institution with economic interests, political relationships, a management structure, and a sophisticated information-gathering capacity, was considerably more worldly than its image, and the worldly elements served the institution well precisely because they were invisible beneath the divine aura. The major Panhellenic festivals, those great athletic and religious gatherings at Olympia and Delphi and Corinth and Nemea that drew competitors and spectators from across the Greek world every 4 years or 2 years depending on the event, present a similar dynamic between official image and operational reality. The official image was one of Panhellenic unity. The games were sacred truce periods, ekakesia, during which warfare between Greek states was suspended to allow safe travel to and from the festival site. Athletes competed not for material prizes but for the sacred crown, the katinos at Olympia, a wreath of wild olive, the laurel at Delphi, the pine at Corinth, the celery at Nemea, humble vegetable materials that signified divine honour rather than earthly reward. The victor was celebrated in odes commissioned from the great choral lyric poets, Pindar above all, that placed his athletic achievement in a mythological context and connected his personal excellence to the heroic tradition. Victory at the games was understood as divine favour made visible in human performance. The operational reality included a great deal of money, considerable commercial activity, and in the spaces around the sacred precincts, a range of services catering to large crowds of visitors that the official image of Panhellenic piety had limited room for. Lodging and food and transport for the crowds were the obvious economic activity, and the cities nearest the festival sites derived substantial income from these. The craftsmen and merchants who set up around the sanctuary boundaries during festival periods sold commemorative objects and practical goods, and whatever the market could bear from the concentration of wealthy visitors. The city of Elis, which administered Olympia, was not a disinterested custodian of the games. It was an institution with its own political interests, its own economic stake in the festival's continued operation and prestige, and its own history of using control of the sanctuary as a lever in regional politics. The victor's material rewards were also rather more substantial than the wild olive wreath in practice. A victor returning to his home city could expect civic benefits of real value: free meals at public expense for life, reserved seats at festivals, statues in the agora and at the sanctuary. The athletic aristocracy of the Greek world, the families that produced generation after generation of competition victors, the Diagorids of Rhodes, and the Alcmeonidae of Athens and others, accumulated social capital and political influence through their athletic victories in ways that made the games quite consequential in earthly political terms, not just in terms of divine favour. the sanctuary's role in Greek politics extended well beyond the festival context. Major decisions about colony foundations, constitutional changes, and wars were often preceded by consultation with the appropriate oracle, and the oracle's response could be understood as authorizing an action or discouraging it, which gave the oracle's administrators a kind of advanced knowledge of, and occasional influence over, the major policy directions of multiple states simultaneously. When Sparta was consulting Delphi about a war with Athens, and Athens was consulting Delphi about a war with Sparta, and both were receiving guidance from the same institution managed by the same priests, the geopolitical implications of that position were not abstract. The priests of Delphi occupied an information node of remarkable sensitivity, and the responses they shaped and transmitted had real consequences for the outcomes they were ostensibly only predicting. The pollution concept, miasma, was the theological mechanism by which the sanctuaries maintained control over access to the sacred. Miasma was real pollution in the Greek understanding, not metaphorical, but an actual contaminating force that attached to a person after certain actions and circumstances, including killing, contact with the dead, childbirth, miscarriage, and certain bodily states, and that spread from person to person and from person to sacred space. Entering a sanctuary while polluted was prohibited, and this prohibition was not merely a rule, but a theological fact about the nature of purity and what the gods required for their spaces to remain properly sacred. The management of miasma created a category of expertise. Priests and specialist purifiers knew the requirements of purification for different types of pollution, the rituals and timings and materials required to restore a person to a state of ritual purity that would allow sanctuary access. This expertise was real and genuinely served a community function, providing a shared framework for managing the anxiety around pollution that Greek religious life generated. But it was also a form of power. The people who knew the rules controlled access to the sacred, and access to the sacred was access to the divine favour that everyone in the city needed to maintain. The right of sanctuary, the protection extended by sacred ground to those who reached it and touched the altar, was one of the sanctuary's most socially significant features, and also one of the most consistently contested ones. The principle was clear: a suppliant at an altar was under divine protection, and removing them by force was an act of impiety that would draw divine punishment on whoever committed it. The practice was considerably more variable. Powerful actors who needed to remove someone from sanctuary found ways to read the principle narrowly, or to wait outside the sanctuary until the fugitive had to leave, or to cut off food and water until surrender became preferable to continued refuge, or simply, in the most extreme cases, to violate the sanctuary directly and accept the ritual pollution that this created, calculating that the political necessity outweighed the theological cost. The Athenians killed the followers of the would-be tyrant Cylon in the late 7th century while they were in sanctuary at the Acropolis altars, holding onto ropes tied to the sacred statues, the ropes breaking as they were dragged away, the breaking understood as the gods withdrawing their protection. The family that carried out this action, the Alcmaeonidae, was cursed for generations because of it, the pollution of sanctuary violation attaching to the bloodline and being used as a political weapon against them for a century. This consequence was real. It was invoked in real political arguments. The theological weight of sanctuary violation was genuine and consequential. And still the violation had happened because the immediate political need had been judged to outweigh it. What the ancient Greeks had in their sanctuaries was something that every complex religious institution in every culture has had: the gap between the ideal that the institution embodies and the human reality of running it. The sanctuaries were genuinely sacred and genuinely political simultaneously. The priests were genuinely pious and genuinely self-interested simultaneously. The oracle was genuinely divine in the Greek understanding and genuinely informed by earthly intelligence simultaneously. The festivals were genuinely religious and genuinely economic and genuinely political simultaneously. These were not contradictions that needed resolving. They were the texture of how religion actually functioned in a society that understood the gods to be present in the world rather than removed from it, which meant that the operations of the divine and the operations of the human were never entirely separable. The Greeks themselves were not naive about this. Greek literature, especially comedy and the genre of philosophical dialogue, includes sharp and knowing observations about religious fraud, corrupt priests, manipulated oracles, and the gap between what the gods are supposed to require and what the people managing the gods' affairs actually do. Aristophanes is funny about this, Euripides is dark about it, Plato is complicated about it. The culture that produced the great sanctuaries also produced a tradition of skeptical inquiry into whether the gods were actually running them in any meaningful sense, and it held both traditions simultaneously, as a conversation rather than a resolution. This is one of the things that makes ancient Greek culture perpetually interesting. It was able to maintain what might seem like irreconcilable positions, genuine piety and genuine skepticism about religious institutions, sincere belief in divine presence and clear-eyed awareness that human beings were managing the divine presence in ways that served human interests. The sacred and the worldly were not separated cleanly. They inhabited the same space, in the same buildings, through the same rituals, managed by the same people who were simultaneously performing a genuinely believed theology and conducting the practical business of an institution that needed to survive and to prosper. The white marble and the smoke of sacrifice were real. The financial ledgers of the temple treasuries and the intelligence networks of the oracular priests were equally real. Understanding the sanctuaries requires holding both in mind at the same time, which is inconvenient but accurate, and which is exactly the kind of intellectual flexibility that the Greeks, at their best, were trying to cultivate in the people who sat in their schools and attended their symposia and walked up the sacred way to ask the god what they should do next. The festival system of ancient Greece extended well beyond the Pan-Hellenic Games, and the local festival calendar of any major city-state was dense with occasions for religious observance that were also occasions for economic activity, social display, artistic competition, and the negotiation of civic identity. Athens alone had more than 120 festival days per year by the classical period, not all of them major, but all of them involving some form of ritual activity that took people away from their ordinary occupations and inserted them into the sacred calendar that structured Athenian time. The Panathenaia was the festival of Athena, Athens' patron goddess, and it was the centerpiece of the Athenian civic year. The Great Panathenaia, held every 4 years, was one of the most significant festivals in the Greek world, attracting competitors and visitors from across the Greek sphere with athletic contests, musical competitions, and the great procession that the Parthenon frieze commemorates, the parade of Athenians and allies carrying the sacred peplos, the robe woven for Athena's cult statue up through the city to the Acropolis. The prize at the Panathenaia was not a wreath but amphorae of olive oil, sacred olive oil from the trees sacred to Athena, in quantities that were genuinely valuable and that made the games economically significant in a way that the Pan-Hellenic crowns were not. The management of the Panathenaia involved officials responsible for organising the competitions, others responsible for the religious ceremonies, and the whole operation required months of preparation and the coordinated effort of multiple civic bodies and private contractors. The Thesmophoria tells us something important about the flexibility of the gender system in Athens. Citizen women had ritual authority in specific sacred contexts that was real and recognised. They served as priestesses of important cults, including the cult of Athena Polias, the most important cult in the city, and the priestess of Athena held a position of genuine civic significance. The spatial restriction of citizen women to the domestic sphere was not total or absolute. It applied to the commercial and political public sphere in ways that did not apply equally to the sacred public sphere. The women who held major priestly offices had access to political and social influence through religious channels that their domestic roles formally denied them through civic channels, and the ancient Greeks understood this and managed it through the careful separation of the sacred and the civic, treating the two spheres as distinct enough that power in one did not automatically translate to power in the other. The practical economic operations of the sanctuary included not just the accumulated donations and consultation fees, but the management of land. Major sanctuaries controlled significant agricultural territory. The Temenos, the sacred precinct extended into farming land, worked to produce income for the sanctuary's maintenance and the support of its personnel. This land could be leased to private farmers, generating rental income, or work directly under priestly supervision. The accounts of temple land management preserved in inscriptions from various sanctuaries give a picture of agricultural administration that is thoroughly practical, concerned with lease terms and rental rates, and the maintenance of property boundaries, in documents that also record dedications to the gods and priestly appointments. the sacred and the administrative appearing in the same documents without apparent tension. The healing sanctuaries of Asclepius introduced another dimension to the religious sanctuary's relationship with its community. The major Asclepiae at Epidaurus, Kos, Pergamon and Athens were organised around the ritual healing sleep, but in practice they operated as something that combined temple, hospital and health resort with dedicated facilities for patients and a record-keeping system that produced the inscribed testimonials, giving us our clearest picture of how the healing process was understood. The relationship between the Asclepian tradition and the Hippocratic tradition was not one of simple opposition. The Hippocratic physicians at Kos were operating in close proximity to the Asclepieion on the island, and patients moved between both approaches. The cult of Asclepius was not antithetical to rational medicine, since Asclepius in the mythological tradition was himself the god of medicine, whose symbol, the serpent-entwined staff, was a medical symbol before it was a religious one, or perhaps was both simultaneously from the beginning. The snakes in the Asclepiae, sacred to the god, were real snakes. They lived in the sanctuary and were understood to carry the healing power of the god, and patients who woke from the encomesis sometimes reported that a snake had licked their wounds during the night, an experience understood as the god's direct intervention. Whether these reports reflect genuine contact with the sanctuary's sacred snakes, which were probably harmless varieties, or the particular vividness of sleep-induced experience in people who had been primed to expect something divine, the healing traditions of the Greek world do not separate into a rational Hippocratic strand and a superstitious religious strand as cleanly as the intellectual history of medicine sometimes suggests. They were intertwined by their practitioners and by their patients, in ways that reflected the ancient Greek understanding of the body as inhabiting a world where the divine and the physical were not different things but different registers of the same continuous reality. The sacred and the earthly in ancient Greek religion were not opposed categories, they were different registers of the same continuous reality. The world as the gods inhabited it, and as human beings inhabited it simultaneously. The sanctuary was a place where that continuity was acknowledged rather than managed. The animals sacrificed their died real deaths and their meat fed real people. The athletic competitions conducted in the god's honour involved real bodies competing with real intensity. The oracles given in the god's name were received by real political actors making real decisions. The sanctuaries were not removed from the world, they were the place where the world most directly met what lay behind it, and what lay behind it was understood to be present in the world at all times, in the oil lamp and the fishing net and the symposium cup and the sleeping mat and every other piece of daily equipment with which people navigated the short and complicated experience of being alive. The Eleusinian mysteries deserve particular attention in any account of Greek sanctuary life, because they represent the most significant and most secretive of the Greek religious institutions, and the one whose gap between external image and internal reality is most completely preserved by the ancient sources, which is to say, preserved as a blank, as an absence, as a space that the sources carefully avoid filling in. The mysteries at Eleusis, a town about 15 miles northwest of Athens, were connected to the cult of Demeter and Persephone, and involved a secret initiation ritual whose precise content was so successfully kept from the uninitiated that it remains unknown despite centuries of ancient speculation and modern scholarship. What we know is structural. The initiates travelled from Athens to Eleusis in a great procession, the Iacchus procession, in late September or early October, through a ritual landscape of sacred stops and ceremonies that prepared them psychologically for the initiation itself. They spent the night in the Telesterion, the great hall at Eleusis built to accommodate thousands of initiates simultaneously, and there something happened, something that ancient descriptions characterize in terms of its psychological effect rather than its content. People emerged from the Telesterion changed. Ancient writers who were themselves initiates, and who therefore knew exactly what had happened, described the experience in terms of transformation, of a new relationship to mortality and to what lay beyond it, of a peace with the fact of death that they had not possessed before. Cicero, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, says that the mysteries had taught him not only to live joyfully, but to die with better hope. What happened in the Telesterion was protected by a prohibition so seriously observed that in the entire ancient record there are only a small number of accounts of people revealing the mysteries, and those accounts are of prosecutions or escapes from prosecution rather than actual revelations. because the revelations themselves were not made public even when the revealer was being punished. The content of the mysteries is still not definitively known, despite the work of generations of classical scholars. Various theories have been proposed involving ritual drama of the Persephone myth, the display of sacred objects, the consumption of a grain-based drink called kykeon that may have contained ergot or other psychoactive compounds, and various combinations of these. None of the theories is conclusively supported by the evidence, because the evidence is precisely what the ancient world chose not to preserve. This is the most extreme version of the gap between the external image and the internal reality of the Greek sanctuary, because in this case the internal reality was successfully concealed and remains concealed. The sanctuary at Eleusis presented an external image of purification, procession, and the agricultural cycle of death and renewal. Whatever the internal reality was, it produced the psychological effects that ancient witnesses describe, effects powerful enough that people travelled from across the ancient world to experience them, and maintained their silence about the content for centuries. The sanctuary system was capable, in this instance, of creating and protecting a genuine mystery, which is perhaps the most human thing about it, the evidence that the institutional machinery could sometimes, in the right circumstances, actually deliver what it promised. The Dionysian traditions deserve attention too, as a counterpoint to the Apollonian clarity and order that the major Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries projected. The cult of Dionysus, the god of wine and transformation and ecstatic dissolution, operated at the edge of the civic religious system in ways that were officially sanctioned and yet perpetually uncomfortable for the authorities who sanctioned them. The Dionysian festivals, the Lenaea and the Dionysia, were major civic occasions in Athens, the occasions for the dramatic performances that produced the great tragedies and comedies of the classical period, and they were thoroughly institutionalized, managed by city officials, funded by wealthy citizens performing the liturgy of chorigos, supporting the dramatic chorus as a public contribution to the city's religious life. But the Dionysian tradition also included the Maenads, the female devotees of Dionysus who were understood in myth to experience a form of religious ecstasy that involved leaving their homes, going into the mountains, and engaging in wild dances and rituals that suspended ordinary social categories. The Maenads appear on the pottery in their characteristic pose, heads thrown back, dressed in fawn skins, carrying the Thyrsos staff wound with ivy, in states that represent the temporary dissolution of the self into the divine possession of the god. Whether historical women actually went into the mountains in the grip of Dionysian ecstasy, or whether the Maenad was primarily a mythological and artistic figure rather than a social reality is debated. What is not debated is that the Dionysian tradition represented within the official religious calendar of Athens an acknowledged space for the suspension of ordinary rules, a sanctioned occasion for behaviour that ordinary Athenian life did not permit, and that this space was occupied primarily by women, at least in the mythology, which is its own kind of comment on what the city understood women to need that the ordinary social structure was not providing. The relationship between the Greek sanctuary and the concept of Pan-Hellenic identity is worth considering as a closing thought on the sanctuaries themselves, because it illuminates something important about how these institutions functioned beyond their purely religious role. The great Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries Olympia, Delphi, Nemea, the Isthmian sanctuary at Corinth, were the only institutions in the ancient Greek world that transcended the boundaries of the individual city-states and created a common identity among people who otherwise defined themselves primarily through their local civic affiliations. The Greek world was fragmented politically into hundreds of independent polis, city-states, each with its own laws, its own currency, its own calendar, its own patron deity, its own bitter history of conflicts with its neighbours. The Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries were the spaces where this fragmentation was temporarily suspended in favour of a larger identity, the identity of being Greek rather than being Athenian, or Spartan, or Corinthian. This larger identity was real and valued and shaped political behaviour in ways that mattered. The sacred truce that enabled travel to the Games was observed because violating it would mean exclusion from the Games, which would mean exclusion from the shared identity that the Games embodied, which was too high a price for most city-states to pay except in the most extreme circumstances. The oracle at Delphi spoke not to Athenians or Spartans but to Greeks, and its authority derived from this Pan-Hellenic standing rather than from any particular state's endorsement of it. When Delphi spoke, It spoke to everyone, which gave its pronouncements a weight that no single city-state's oracle could have. But the Pan-Hellenic identity that the sanctuaries embodied and promoted was also a fragile and contested thing, because the city-states that participated in it did not stop competing with each other outside its boundaries, and the competitions inside the sanctuaries were themselves intensely political. The treasury buildings at Delphi were not just dedications to the god, they were civic self-advertisements, each one broadcasting the wealth and piety and cultural achievements of the state that built it. The athletic victories at Olympia were celebrated at home as civic triumphs, the ode commissioned from Pindar not just for the victor personally, but for the city that produced him. The Pan-Hellenic unity was built on and expressed through competitive distinction, a Greek paradox that perhaps explains why the Greek world, despite the Pan-Hellenic festivals and the shared language and the shared cultural traditions, never managed to produce a lasting political unity, because the very institutions that articulated the common identity also made the individual distinctions within it permanently visible and permanently contested. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This is the Greek sanctuary in its full complexity, a place of genuine divine presence and institutional machinery, of sacred purity and borrowed temple funds, of Pan-Hellenic unity and intensely civic competition, of ritual silence and practical information exchange, of the highest human aspiration and the most ordinary human interest, all of it happening in the same space, managed by the same people, in the service of an idea that was both genuinely believed and thoroughly instrumentalized. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of institution that human beings build when they need something to be both truly important and practically useful, and the history of such institutions, from the Greek sanctuary to every institution of comparable ambition that has come after it, is the history of that tension, never resolved, always managed, perpetually fascinating to observe. One last element of the Athenian world that most accounts omit entirely is the particular role of the harbour city of Piraeus, which was connected to Athens by the long walls, but was socially and culturally quite distinct from it. Piraeus was a port, which meant it was a place where the ordered social categories of Athens proper were more permeable, where foreigners and their customs and their commerce arrived daily from across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, where the enslaved people who crewed the naval vessels, the oarsmen of the Athenian fleet, lived in a kind of close proximity to free citizens that the interior of the city tried to manage more carefully. The fleet was one of the foundations of Athenian power, and the fleet was rowed by tens of thousands of men, many of them of the lowest census class, the Thetes, who had no property qualification for citizenship, but who were politically enfranchised in Athens in ways that other city-states found alarming, because a democracy that empowered its poorest citizens to vote was, in the eyes of Sparta and its allies, a city that had lost its political bearings. The oarsmen of the fleet voted in the assembly. They were citizens, their voices counted. The democratic logic was that the men who defended the city with their bodies and their labour had the right to participate in its governance, and this logic, followed to its conclusion, produced a democracy that was more inclusive than the philosophical texts typically suggest, even as it excluded women and foreigners and enslaved people in ways that the philosophical texts tend not to emphasize. And now the night has done most of its work, and Athens is breathing quietly under a sky full of stars that the city's oil lamps cannot quite compete with. We have spent tonight in a world that is simultaneously very ancient and very present. The distance from 5th century Athens to the moment you are lying in is approximately 25 centuries, which is a long way in terms of the specific arrangements of daily life, the clay pots and the shite on pins and the particular smell of the agora on a warm morning. But in terms of the underlying human architecture, the gap is not as wide as that number implies. The Athens we visited is a city managing the same tensions that every complex society manages. The gap between the official story of itself and the daily reality of how it actually operates. The distance between the ideal of its institutions and the human compromises that keep those institutions running. The contradiction between what it says about equality and freedom and what it actually practices when it comes to the people who do not fit the official categories of the beneficiaries of those values. The question of who gets to speak and whose speech gets written down and preserved. Athens faced all of these questions with unusual self-awareness, which did not mean it resolved them. but which produced a body of literature and philosophy and art that was essentially asking those questions out loud, in public, with remarkable honesty about the fact that no clean answer had yet been found. The symposium existed in the space between the formal public face of Athenian civic life and the more intimate, more honest, more emotionally present conversations that could only happen in the private room with the head wreaths and the diluted wine, and the game where you flung the dregs of your cup at a target and named the person you desired. The Greeks understood that you needed both of these spaces. They built both of them carefully. The public and the private were not the same space, and the rules of one did not entirely apply in the other, and that difference was not a failure of consistency, but a feature of a culture that had thought carefully about what different kinds of engagement required. The sanctuaries existed in the space between the divine and the practical, holding both simultaneously in the way that every religious institution holds both simultaneously, the theological purpose and the institutional reality, the genuine belief and the human management of that belief. The Greeks were honest about this, at least in their literature, even when they were not honest about it in their official statements. What connects all of it, the smell of the agora and the trial of Aspasia and the head wreath and the borrowed temple funds, is the basic fact of humanness. The people in 5th century Athens were people doing what people do, which is living inside systems that were not designed for their full complexity, finding the spaces within those systems that allowed genuine life to happen, making accommodations with the distance between the ideal and the actual, and occasionally, improbably, producing something extraordinary anyway. The philosophy survived. The democracy, flawed and limited and eventually overwhelmed, left a template that later centuries returned to repeatedly. The poetry is still being read. The questions are still being asked. The wreath is still being put on, in 1,000 different forms, in rooms that still want the rules to be slightly suspended. Let all of you were somewhere real tonight. Not the clean version. The actual one. With the garlic and the complexity and the woman whose voice did not survive and the game with the wine dregs and the priests who knew more than they were saying. That is the version worth knowing. That is the version still alive under the marble. Sleep well. History is patient. It will be here when you wake up. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.